Okay, good morning everybody. So I'm Ben Johnson from the Met Office, and I'm going to talk to you today about the simulation of biomass burning in HadGEM3. So just to run you through the contents of my talk. So we have a new Earth system model that we're developing at the Met Office, along with NERC, UK-wide kind of thing. And we will have a new aerosol scheme called UKCA mode. So we're looking at whether this has got an improved representation of aerosol for climate interactions. So the question is really, how well does this scheme perform for biomass burning aerosols? And I'm going to give you the answer straight out. Aerosol properties seem to be well represented, but we do have to double the biomass burning aerosols to get the right AOD. So this is quite a serious problem that I'm going to sort of go into a little bit. So HadGEM3 is the third generation of the Hadley Centre's global environment model. It's a coupled atmosphere, ocean, land and ice model. And the Earth system component to this is still under development and has become a UK-wide effort. And once this is included, it will become the UK Earth system model, UK ESM. And it includes a new chemistry and aerosol scheme called UKCA. The aerosol part of that is GLOMAP mode, or otherwise known as UKCA mode. And it's essentially a modal scheme where you have all of the aerosol components mixed within a variety of size modes. And this is much more physical than the original scheme in HadGEM2. We had a scheme called Classic. And so this is, by the way, the same aerosol scheme that Carly used in the first presentation this morning. So it's intended to be much more sophisticated. So the question is, so does this new scheme give an improvement over Classic? So here I'm showing you the aerosol optical depth at 550 nanometers from HadGEM3, running with both the old Classic scheme and the new one, and comparing that with MODIS Collection 6. And so you can see there are some improvements in the aerosol. For example, the Southern Ocean had a high bias in AOD that's largely gone away now in our new model. We also had too little aerosol up here on the high latitude continents, and this is now improved. But unfortunately in the tropics you can see in neither scheme did we have quite enough dust, for example, compared to MODIS. And unfortunately for me, if you look at the biomass burning regions, such as South America, we have now a drop in the AOD over that region that doesn't really agree very well with the observations. So that's a bit of a shame. So in this talk I'm going to look at perhaps why that would be, and why we have to actually tune up the biomass burning aerosol to get the right answer. So let's have a little closer look at that AOD bias. So now I'm just showing you the UKCA mode simulations compared against MODIS. And this is the control run where I don't tune up the biomass burning emissions, but if I double them, then I get about the right magnitude of the AOD. There's still a little bit of a bias towards this western region rather than the eastern region. And this goes back to the GFED emissions, which tend to produce a lot of emission over the deep forested regions and less over the Cerrado regions where the biomass density is lower and where you have a lot of small fires which are harder to detect from the burn scars. So moving on then, I would just want to make the point that, scaling up your emissions is not really a very satisfactory thing to do. We really need to understand this problem. And it's perhaps, you can't just blame it on the emission data set. When you think about it, you have the aerosol properties that could be wrong. But the other side of the equation, of course, is the removal of the aerosol in the atmosphere, which is equally as important as what's going up. And unfortunately, that's a less sexy topic and receives a lot less attention. But I will be giving it a little bit of attention, and I think we need more observational constraints on that as well. Okay, so let's have a little look at how well the aerosol properties are represented in this scheme for biomass burning. And so I'm going to be using the SAMBBA observations from the aircraft and the aerosol in situ probes that Will was talking about. And thank you, Will, for giving a really good overview of SAMBBA to put this into context. So first of all, let's have a look at the aerosol size distribution, which is, of course, very important for the aerosol. And I'm showing here now just the campaign mean observations against the monthly mean model output for the September in that season. And so you have a variety of the aerosol probes here, and they're showing pretty good agreement with each other, apart from perhaps in this really tiny nucleation range where you have two SMPSs giving a slightly different story. But never mind, let's have a look at the model. UKCA mode is doing a pretty good job at getting the size distribution across, the main part of that size range, which is really good because a lot of effort was put into representing explicitly the aerosol microphysics. If you contrast that with our original scheme, Classic just had a specified log normal for the size distribution just to capture the accumulation mode. And whilst that gave a good basis for predicting the optical properties, the cloud interaction there was much more limited. So, a little thumbs up for that. Next, I'm looking at the aerosol composition. So this is taking data from the FAM aircraft, from the aerosol mass spectrometer, and the SP2 instrument. And I'm comparing it against these two models. And I've made a split between the western and eastern region. And as Will pointed out, you had higher black carbon contents in the eastern region, a slightly different composition. So, the first thing to notice is that organic carbon strongly dominates the aerosol in both the observations and the model. There's very, very little of the anthropogenic type aerosol in comparison. So, the other thing to note is that the black carbon, which is down here in the black with the numbers, the classic model underestimates the black carbon quite badly in the eastern region, whereas UKCA mode is bang on the money in the western region and is fairly close to the observations in the eastern region. So I'm quite pleased that we've got the black carbon content at least improved in this model. And moving on now to look at the aerosol optical properties. So, for example, let's look at the absorption by looking at the single scattering albedo. So we have slightly higher levels of absorption in the modal scheme, and that's obviously due to the increased black carbon content. Now, it's notoriously difficult to get constraints on absorption, but we do at least have some data from AeroNet, and this agrees exactly with our model. So if you believe AeroNet, then we're doing fine. From the aircraft, we have measurements, but of course these are dried by the instruments, so it makes the comparison a little bit difficult. But nevertheless, it looks like the model is in the right ballpark. Now, to go to the specific extinction coefficient, now, obviously this is an incredibly important parameter because it relates the AOD to the mass. And so if you're having to tune up your emissions of mass, it could well be that your extinction is wrong. So let's have a look. So the two different versions of the model, if you consider the moist aerosol at ambient humidities, give about the same extinction coefficient. And it's interesting, the dry aerosol, if you to remove all of the water, you get a massive difference actually between the dry and wet extinction coefficient in mode. So it's telling you that basically the water is doing at least, well, actually more than half of the scattering is down to the water in the aerosol. And I don't necessarily believe that. I think that could be slightly overdone. But we have very poor or very limited constraints on the moist value of specific extinction. You can't really, it doesn't pop naturally out of AeroNet. And of course on the aircraft we dry the aerosols, so we can only really compare the dry values if that's at all meaningful. But if you have some suggestions as to how to make the appropriate corrections to this, I would love to hear, so I can do a better job of constraining that. I'm not going to get into that. As the last thing I'm going to show for results, here is the vertical distribution of the aerosol. So this is now taking, the black line is the observed profile in the western region. So this line here. And I'm essentially taking all of the profiles during SAMBBA and comparing that against the monthly mean from the model. And so the standard case from the model is this blue line. And you can see it does a pretty good job, actually. We have a little bit of an overestimation because we had a bias towards more aerosol in the western region where there's more forest. But other than that, it's doing okay. Now, just to mention, in our standard case, what we do in our model is that we inject the aerosol uniformly between 0 and 3 kilometers. And we have to do this to represent the buoyancy of the plumes and the plume rise. Now, if you don't do that, if you emit everything at the surface, you get this red line here, which is, obviously you can see is completely wrong. And not only that, you get a factor of 4 increase in your surface concentration. So this has major ramifications for comparing with surface data. It basically shows you, if you were to try and validate your model with surface data, you're completely wide open to how you represent this elevation of the plumes. The other thing I've shown here is the impact of turning off one of the aerosol removal processes. So in this region, wet removal by convective precipitation is one of the dominant removal mechanisms. And we have now a new scheme that kind of resolves the subgrid scale convection and the scavenging from those plumes. And if you turn that off, then you revert back to a simpler form of removal where it's just based on the grid box mean. And that wasn't an aggressive removal process. So switching between those two schemes means that you essentially remove less aerosol here, particularly in the upper troposphere, and so you get the wrong vertical distribution here. So I'm just highlighting this, that, you know, we're very concerned about the fact that you need to tune these models, bump up the emissions, but, you know, how much you bump them up depends an awful lot on how you represent various things in your model. So, to conclude, I hope I've shown you today that we have a reasonable simulation of biomass burning aerosol in our model. It's a good basis to move on to do some climate studies. But you know, you do need to pay attention to how you inject the biomass burning into your model loft and how you represent the atmospheric processes. Makes a big difference to your simulation. And I think the final conclusion really is that we still need to tune these things up. And in my case, it was a factor of 2, but in other models, anything up to a factor of 5 has been used. So future directions is really, I'd like to highlight that we're looking at this in Aerocom. We have an experiment to explore basically this tuning problem. And possibly newer emissions data sets will help. There's also the issue of how the condensation adds mass during aging. And that's something that is also very uncertain in the models that we want to look at. So thank you for your attention. Happy to take questions. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And we find that too, that if you double it, well, you get it right in Brazil, but you get it too much in Africa. And it's true, these things are regionally dependent. So I think we need to understand the emissions better as well as the atmospheric models, basically, to try and understand why we have these discrepancies.
I had a quick question. I was wondering, so you showed that the water was responsible for so much scattering. Is it the sulfate that's driving the growth in your model, or are the organics also growing?
I think the sulfate is doing a lot of the growth, but it's kind of about 50-50. Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, in terms of the biomass burning aerosol, I mean, one of the main issues is how much additional mass does the aerosol take on during the aging process. And in this model, there's very little. In the original scheme, we had basically a specified growth curve with a 6-hour e-folding time. Here we're trying to do it more from the physical properties, but it doesn't really add very much in our model because we don't represent all of the VOCs that are relevant. And I think that the jury is still a little bit out on actually how much growth and how much loss you get from evaporation and breakdown and so on. So yeah, it's an important problem, but I don't know quite which way to go with that.